In the hushed, amber-lit sanctuary of Aurelia, Manhattan's most exclusive dining establishment, an act of such profound cruelty was about to unfold that within 10 minutes it would shatter the restaurant's 3 Michelin star reputation and send shockwaves through the entire hospitality industry. A woman named Eleanor Vance, the restaurant's impeccably dressed and notoriously cold general manager, was about to commit an act so vile, so utterly devoid of humanity, that she would soon be watching NYPD officers clear a path through her terrified patrons, specifically for her. She didn't know it yet, but the young black man she was stalking toward, the one seated at a small corner table with his sister, was connected to a life-sustaining medical device. More importantly, she didn't know that the quiet, elderly gentleman sitting alone by the window, the one who had been observing her with unnervingly sharp blue eyes for the past year, was not just another wealthy patron. He was Alistair Finch, a man whose quiet investments controlled the very ground the restaurant was built on, and he was about to become her worst nightmare. She had no idea her next actions would be filmed by a dozen smartphones, viewed by 60 million people before sunrise, and result in criminal charges that would utterly incinerate the life she had so meticulously constructed. This is the story of how prejudice in a place of privilege became attempted murder, how a stranger's quiet grief became a catalyst for thunderous justice, and how one young woman's unwavering dignity in the face of abject hatred would rewrite the rules of service and compassion forever. Aurelia was more than a restaurant. It was a theater of wealth. Every detail, from the hand-blown Murano glass chandeliers that dripped light like liquid gold to the fret linens that graced each table, was curated to project an aura of effortless, old-money elegance. The price of admission was a reservation made 6 months in advance and a willingness to spend $1,000 on dinner for 2. It was a world of quiet power, where deals were brokered over seared foie gras and relationships were sealed with the pop of a vintage Krug. 22-year-old Maya Washington moved through this world like a ghost. She was a sommelier in training, a position she had fought tooth and nail to earn. She possessed a palate so refined it was almost supernatural, a gift she had cultivated since she was a little girl, identifying the notes of mint in her grandmother's iced tea and the hint of cinnamon in the autumn air. At Aurelia, she could identify a wine's vintage, region, and even the specific slope of the hill its grapes were grown on, with a single, thoughtful sip. It was a skill that had impressed the head sommelier, a notoriously gruff Frenchman who saw in her a rare, prodigious talent. But to Eleanor Vance, Maya was an anomaly, an imperfection in her perfectly curated masterpiece. Eleanor, a woman of 50, with a severe blonde bob and a wardrobe of punishingly sharp Armani suits, believed in standards. Her standards. To her, Maya's presence, with her intricate braids, often adorned with a single, tasteful silver bead, and her quiet, observant demeanor, was a constant, low-grade irritation. She was the type of manager who would check Maya's uniform for microscopic lint while ignoring a white waiter's scuffed shoes. She would question Maya's pairing suggestions in front of guests, only to have the head sommelier later confirm Maya's choice was not just correct, but inspired. Eleanor had been the subject of quiet complaints to HR before, but she was a master of plausible deniability, her prejudice always cloaked in the language of maintaining excellence and brand integrity. Maya endured it all because she had to. The salary and tips from Aurelia were the only thing keeping her and her 17-year-old brother, Leo, afloat. Leo was Maya's entire world. He was a brilliant, funny, and deeply kind young man who was supposed to be a freshman at Columbia, studying astrophysics. Instead, his universe was largely confined to their small, fifth-floor walk-up apartment in Washington Heights. 3 years ago, he had been diagnosed with an aggressive and rare form of pulmonary fibrosis, a disease that scarred his lungs and made every breath a battle. His constant companion was a portable oxygen concentrator, a device the size of a small carry-on bag that hummed softly, pulling in ambient air, purifying it, and delivering a steady stream of medical-grade oxygen to his lungs through a thin, clear cannula. The machine was his lifeline. It was FAA approved for air travel, FDA certified, and Maya carried a binder of medical documentation for it that was as thick as a novel. Today was a good day. A very good day. Leo had just received news that he'd won a prestigious scholarship for a remote learning program at MIT, a full ride that would allow him to pursue his passion from home. He had been so ecstatic, his joy so bright and pure, that it seemed to light up their whole apartment. "We have to celebrate, May," he'd said, his voice raspy but firm. "A real celebration. Not just pizza. I want to see where you work. I want to see the fancy place." Maya's heart had ached. She knew Eleanor's rules. No disturbances. No irregularities. But looking at her brother's hopeful face, the light in his eyes that had been so dim for so long, she couldn't say no. She made a plan. She would bring him in at 4:30 p.m., the dead hour between the late lunch service and the evening prep. The main dining room would be empty, save for a few staff members. She got permission from Chef Antoine, the restaurant's executive chef, a man who valued humanity over protocol and had a soft spot for Maya. "Bring the boy," he'd said with a gruff wave of his hand. "I will make him a dessert that will make the angels weep." She settled Leo at a small, discreet table in the corner, his concentrator tucked neatly beside him, its gentle hum completely lost in the vast, quiet space. He looked around in awe, his eyes wide, taking in the soaring ceilings and the opulent decor. "Wow," he whispered. "It's like a palace." Maya's heart swelled. For a moment, he wasn't a sick kid. He was just a teenager, impressed by a fancy room. She was just about to go to the kitchen to get his dessert when the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. Eleanor Vance stood at the entrance to the dining room, her arms crossed, her face a mask of controlled fury. She hadn't been scheduled to be in until 5, but she had come in early. Her eyes, the color of chips of ice, swept past Maya and landed on Leo. Then, they narrowed on the machine beside him. These two observations, the black teenager in her pristine dining room during off hours and the medical device, collided in her mind to form a single, toxic conclusion. "What is this?" she said, her voice low and venomous. She didn't walk toward them. She advanced, like a predator stalking wounded prey. "Eleanor, I can explain," Maya began, stepping in front of her brother protectively. "This is my brother, Leo. Chef Antoine said we could—" "I'm not speaking to you," Eleanor hissed, her gaze still fixed on Leo. "I'm asking what all that is." She gestured to the oxygen concentrator with a flick of her wrist, as if it were a piece of garbage. "It's my oxygen, Mom," Leo said, his voice quiet but steady. He'd faced down doctors with grim prognoses and nights where he wasn't sure he'd see the morning. He was not easily intimidated. "It helps me breathe." "This is a 3 Michelin-star restaurant, not a hospital ward," Eleanor snapped. "This device is a violation of our standards. It's a safety hazard. It's unsightly." "It's been approved by every relevant safety board in the country," Maya said, her own voice hardening. "It's quieter than the air conditioning. We have all the documentation." She reached for her bag, for the binder that was her shield against this exact kind of ignorance. I don't care about your documentation, Eleanor spat. I care about the ambiance of my restaurant. The presence of this thing is disruptive. You will take it, and you will leave. Now. From his table by the window, Alistair Finch put down his copy of the Wall Street Journal. He was a man of 75, with a shock of white hair and a face etched with the fine lines of a life lived with both great success and profound loss. He had been a widower for 10 years and had been coming to Aurelia 3 times a week for the past 2, ever since his own home had become too quiet, too full of ghosts. He enjoyed the food, but mostly he came to watch the city live and breathe. He had noticed Maya early on. He'd seen her talent, her grace under pressure, and he had seen the subtle, relentless campaign of psychological warfare Eleanor waged against her. He had said nothing, because it was not his place. That was about to change. The boy is not bothering anyone, Eleanor, he said, his voice calm and resonant, carrying across the empty room. Eleanor's head whipped around, her composure momentarily fractured by the interruption from one of her most valued customers. A practiced, insincere smile plastered itself on her face. Mr. Finch, I do apologize. I am simply handling an internal staffing issue and a minor safety concern. It looked to me like you were harassing a child, Finch replied, his eyes never leaving hers. The flush of anger on Eleanor's cheeks deepened. Being challenged, especially in front of a wealthy patron, was an unforgivable offense. She turned her fury back on Maya and Leo, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. I will not have this argument. You were told to leave. We're not leaving, Maya said, her chin held high. She thought of the light in Leo's eyes, the simple joy of this one small celebration. She would not let this woman extinguish it. Chef Antoine gave us permission. We will have our dessert, and then we will go. Chef Antoine does not make policy, Eleanor snarled. I do, and I am telling you that this machine is a fire hazard. The lithium battery, the electrical components, it's a liability I will not tolerate. That's patently false, Maya shot back, her fear being rapidly replaced by a cold, hard anger. The battery is medically shielded and has a lower fire risk than the cell phone in your pocket. It's been on hundreds of flights, in hospitals, in schools. It is not a fire hazard. I am the manager of this establishment, and my determination is final, Eleanor declared, her voice rising. A few kitchen staff had poked their heads out, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. A busboy, a young kid named Marco, discreetly angled his phone, his thumb hovering over the record button. You have 10 seconds to remove yourselves, and that ticking time bomb from my restaurant before I have you removed for trespassing. You can't be serious, Maya whispered, incredulous. 10. Leo reached for his sister's hand. His breathing was becoming slightly more labored, the stress constricting his airways. Maybe we should just go. It's okay. No, Maya said, squeezing his hand. No, we are not moving. 9. Alistair Finch slowly folded his newspaper and placed it on the table. He took a sip of his water. He was watching Eleanor with an expression of profound disappointment, like a biologist observing a specimen revert to its most primitive instincts. 8. I am not going to warn you again. This is private property. You are violating the Americans with Disabilities Act, Maya said, her voice shaking slightly but clear. You are discriminating against him based on his medical needs. 7. Marco the busboy hit record. Across the room, a pastry chef, hidden by the kitchen door, did the same. 6. Don't lecture me on the law, little girl. I am concerned with the safety of my patrons. What patrons? Maya demanded, gesturing at the empty dining room. There is no one here but us and Mr. Finch. and he doesn't seem to be concerned. 5. Eleanor took a step closer. Her eyes were locked on the oxygen concentrator. In her warped mind, it had become the symbol of everything she detested: imperfection, disorder, the intrusion of the unpleasant realities of the world into her pristine sanctuary. 4. Eleanor, stop this, Mr. Finch warned, his voice now carrying a distinct edge of command. But Eleanor was beyond reason. She was trapped in a feedback loop of her own authority and prejudice. The rage, the years of perceived slights, the challenge from a subordinate she viewed as inferior, it all coalesced into a single, monstrous impulse. 3. Maya moved, positioning her body fully between Eleanor and her brother's lifeline. 2. Eleanor reached past her, her manicured fingers adorned with a single, cold diamond wrapped around the handle of the portable oxygen concentrator. "I told you," she seethed, "that this does not belong here." And in one swift, horrifying motion, a motion that would be replayed on a loop on every news channel in the country, she yanked the machine away. The force of the pull ripped the thin plastic cannula from Leo's face. The machine's alarm shrieked instantly, a high-pitched, piercing wail of electronic panic that shattered the sacred silence of Aurelia. Leo gasped, a raw, desperate sound. His hands flew to his throat as his oxygen-starved lungs screamed. His face, which had been pale, began to take on a terrifying bluish tint around his lips. The air in the room, so plentiful for everyone else, was a poison he could not process. The world exploded into motion. Maya screamed, a primal cry of terror and rage, lunging for the machine. Alistair Finch was on his feet with a speed that defied his age, his chair clattering to the floor. He wasn't just fast, he was decisive. He intercepted Eleanor, not with force, but with a solid, immovable presence, blocking her retreat. "Give the girl the machine," he commanded, his voice a low growl of absolute authority. Eleanor, momentarily stunned by the physical intervention and the screaming alarm, froze. Her face was a grotesque mask of shock and fury. "It's a hazard! I was securing it!" she shrieked, her justification sounding pathetic even to her own ears. Maya didn't wait. She snatched the concentrator from Eleanor's grasp, her hands trembling so violently she could barely function. She fumbled with the delicate cannula, her vision blurred by tears of panic. "Leo, baby, I'm here! I'm here!" she chanted, her voice frantic. 5 seconds. That's how long Leo was without oxygen. 5 seconds that stretched into an eternity. 5 seconds of his body fighting a war it could not win. 5 seconds captured in crystal-clear high definition from 2 different angles. She finally managed to refit the prongs into his nostrils. The blessed hiss of purified oxygen filled the tube, and Leo took a ragged, shuddering breath, then another. The bluish tint began to recede, but he was pale and trembling, his eyes wide with the residual terror of suffocation. He slumped against the banquette, his chest heaving. The kitchen doors burst open. Chef Antoine, his face white with shock, ran out, followed by 6 other staff members. The busboy, Marco, was still recording, his face a mixture of fear and righteous determination. Eleanor Vance stood in the center of the room, suddenly aware of the tableau of horror she had created. The screaming alarm, the terrified gasps of her staff, the sick child now struggling to recover, and the glacial, unforgiving stare of Alistair Finch. It was a safety protocol," she stammered, the lie crumbling as it left her lips. "You tried to kill him," Chef Antoine said, his voice a horrified whisper. "My God, Eleanor, we all saw it. You tried to kill a child." And that's when Alistair Finch, the quiet, elderly gentleman who read the paper by the window, stood up to his full height, pulled out a phone, that looked deceptively simple, and made a call that would bring an empire to its knees. "Arthur, it's Alistair," he said, his voice deadly calm. There was no need for introductions. "I'm at Aurelia. We have a code black, an assault on a miner by the general manager, Eleanor Vance. I want her employment terminated, effective immediately. I want her blacklisted from every property associated with the Finch Hospitality Group, and I want you to call the NYPD. Tell them I am a personal witness to an attempted murder. Yes, I'll wait." Eleanor's face drained of all color. Finch Hospitality Group. The name echoed in the cavernous room, a name she had only ever seen on the highest level corporate letterhead. It was the parent company, the shadowy, multi-billion-dollar entity that owned Aurelia and 24 other luxury hotels and restaurants around the world. You can't," she whispered, the foundation of her world turning to sand beneath her feet. "Who are you?" Alistair Finch looked at her, and for the first time she saw not a polite, elderly customer, but something ancient and powerful, a force of nature she had been foolish enough to provoke. "I'm the man who signs your paycheck, Eleanor," he said, his voice flat and cold as a tombstone. "Or rather, I was. You just assaulted a child in front of me, in my building. Your career is over. The only question now is how many years you'll spend in prison." The thing about power, the real, earth-shaking kind, is that it doesn't need to shout. It operates in the quiet commands that rearrange the world, in the calm phone calls that summon storms. Eleanor Vance had spent her career wielding a petty, superficial authority, a power derived from a title and a uniform. She was a gatekeeper of velvet ropes and leather-bound menus, but she had just come face to face with the man who owned the gates, the ropes, the building, and the very air she was breathing. Alistair Finch's call lasted less than 2 minutes. In that time, a series of invisible levers were pulled across the city. The CEO of Finch Hospitality was pulled out of a board meeting. The group's head of security, a former NYPD deputy commissioner, was alerted, and a half-dozen of the city's top lawyers were activated, their billing clocks starting instantly. Around Eleanor, the world she had commanded had turned on her. Her own staff stared at her with a mixture of fear and contempt. Chef Antoine had his arm around Maya, who was whispering reassurances to her still-shaken brother. Marco, the busboy, had stopped recording and was now quietly sending the video file to his cousin, who worked for a local news station. The ecosystem of Aurelia, once held in thrall by her iron will, was now a collection of witnesses to her downfall. The wail of approaching sirens grew from a distant cry to an undeniable reality. "You can't do this!" Eleanor finally shrieked, her composure shattering completely. "It was a misunderstanding. I was concerned about safety." "You were concerned about your own bigotry," Maya's voice cut through the chaos. She had risen to her feet, her arm still protectively around Leo's shoulders. Her eyes, though red-rimmed from tears, burned with a righteous fire. "You saw a black kid with a medical device, and you decided he didn't belong. You didn't see a person. You saw a problem. That's all you've ever seen when you look at me." "That's not true. I'm not a racist," Eleanor cried, a desperate, reflexive denial. "Isn't it?" Maya pressed on, her voice gaining strength. "You question my wine pairings, but praise the white servers for the exact same choices. You inspect my uniform for flaws you ignore in others. You decided we didn't belong the second you saw us. The machine was just your excuse." Every staff member in the room knew it was true. They had all seen it, day after day. The small cuts, the microaggressions, the subtle poison of her prejudice. Now, in the harsh light of her monstrous act, It was all laid bare. The front doors of Aurelia were pushed open, not by a doorman, but by 2 uniformed NYPD officers, followed by 2 paramedics who made a beeline for Leo. "I'm Alistair Finch," he said to the lead officer, a stern-faced sergeant. "I'm the one who called. The woman in the grey suit is Eleanor Vance. She assaulted this young man by forcibly removing his life-sustaining medical equipment." He gestured to his own phone. "I have a video. So do at least 2 of the staff." The sergeant's eyes widened slightly. He knew the name. Everyone in New York with any connection to real estate or high society knew the name Finch. This was no longer a simple assault call. The paramedics were checking Leo's vitals, their voices calm and professional. His oxygen saturation was slowly returning to normal, but his heart rate was dangerously high. "We need to take him to the hospital for observation," one of them said to Maya. "The stress on his system could cause complications." The sergeant turned to Eleanor. "Ma'am, I need you to come with us." "This is absurd," she protested, trying to summon the last vestiges of her authority. "I am the general manager here. I was enforcing a safety rule." "You can explain that down at the precinct," the officer said, his voice devoid of sympathy. He and his partner took her by the arms. As they guided her past the tables, past the staff who refused to meet her eyes, she looked at Maya one last time. "You did this," she hissed. "You and your charity case. You ruined everything." "No," Maya replied, her voice as cold and clear as ice. "You did this to yourself. You just weren't powerful enough to get away with it." The sight of Eleanor Vance, the Queen of Aurelia, being escorted out of her own kingdom in handcuffs, was a seismic event. As the police car pulled away, a crowd was already gathering on the sidewalk, drawn by the sirens and the sight of a news van that had arrived with astonishing speed. Marco's cousin had worked fast. Inside, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a crushing wave of exhaustion and fear. Leo was being carefully placed on a stretcher, and the reality of what had just happened crashed down on Maya. Her brother, her fragile, brilliant brother, could have died. Over a dessert. Because a hateful woman couldn't stand the sight of him. Alistair Finch placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He'll be all right, my dear. He's a strong boy." She almost killed him," Maya whispered, her body trembling. "Yes, she did," Finch said, his voice grim. "And she will answer for it. I promise you that." He then turned to Chef Antoine. "Close the restaurant. Send everyone home. Full pay for the week. The restaurant will be closed until further notice." He looked at the assembled staff. "You all did the right thing. You were brave. The Finch Group does not forget bravery." He then turned back to Maya. "I'll ride with you to the hospital. We have a few things to discuss." The aftermath was not a simple, clean resolution. It was a slow, grinding process, fraught with legal complexities and emotional fallout. Leo was admitted to Mount Sinai, where doctors confirmed the paramedics' fears. The acute stress and temporary oxygen deprivation had exacerbated his underlying condition. It was a significant setback, undoing months of slow, painstaking progress. The doctor's words were a gut punch to Maya. "He's stable, but his lung function has decreased. We'll need to keep him here for a while, perhaps a few weeks." This was a serious trauma to his system. While Maya sat by her brother's bedside, holding his hand as he drifted in and out of a restless sleep, the story exploded. The video, raw and horrifying, went viral. Justice for Leo and Ito Aurelia assault trended worldwide. Eleanor Vance's face was plastered across every news site, her name becoming a byword for privileged, racist cruelty. The Finch Hospitality Group's PR machine went into overdrive, issuing statements, firing Eleanor publicly, and promising a full internal investigation. But Alistair Finch was not interested in PR. He was interested in justice. In the hospital's quiet family lounge, over cups of vending machine coffee, he finally told Maya why he had intervened so decisively. "I had a grandson," he began, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw despite the passing years. "His name was Thomas. He had cystic fibrosis. A fighter, just like your brother. He had his own machines, his own routines." Finch's eyes stared at a point on the far wall, seeing a ghost. "We were at a resort, one of my own hotels. The silence that followed the siren's fade was more profound, more terrifying than the chaos it replaced. In the sterile, white-walled quiet of Leo's room at Mount Sinai, the only sound was the rhythmic, metronomic puff and hiss of the hospital-grade oxygen machine. It was a sound that had been the background music to their lives for 3 years, but now it sounded different. It sounded fragile. It sounded like a promise that could be broken. Maya sat in a stiff, unforgiving chair, her hands clenched into fists in her lap, watching the gentle rise and fall of her brother's chest. He was asleep, sedated, a pale shadow against the bleached sheets. The doctors had spoken to her in a language of hushed urgencies and clinical compassion. Acute stress event, exacerbated pulmonary scarring, prolonged observation. They were words that built a wall between the 5 seconds of horror in the restaurant and the potential lifetime of consequences. She had nodded, understood none of it and all of it, and then retreated to this silent vigil. Alistair Finch had not left. He sat in a chair across the small room, a sentinel of quiet grief. He hadn't spoken of his grandson yet. He had simply handled everything with a quiet, devastating efficiency that Maya could only observe with a sense of numb detachment. He had arranged for the best pulmonologist in the state to be waiting for them. He had secured a private room. He had spoken in low, authoritative tones on his phone, and the world had reconfigured itself around their tragedy. But now, in the quiet of the room, he was not a titan of industry. He was an old man, watching a sick child, and the lines on his face seemed to be carved by a pain she was only just beginning to comprehend. "They used to have a name for it," he said, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the air. "The doctors. They called it psychosocial stress-induced hypoxia. A fancy way of saying that fear can steal your breath just as surely as a disease can." Maya didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on Leo. "He wanted dessert," she whispered, the words feeling like shards of glass in her throat. "That's all. A celebration. I took him there. I put him in her path." "No," Alistair said, the word sharp, cutting through her spiraling guilt. "You gave him a moment of joy. A monster tried to turn it into a tragedy. The sin is hers, Maya, not yours. Do not ever carry it for her." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his sharp blue eyes holding hers. "I had a grandson, Thomas. He had lungs that fought him every day of his life. We were at a resort in the Caribbean. One of mine. A new manager, a man much like Eleanor in his soul, told my daughter that Thomas's nebulizer was aesthetically displeasing by the main pool. He suggested they use a service corridor." Alistair's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "My daughter, she never made a fuss. She agreed. She took my grandson, my beautiful, brave boy, into a concrete hallway to take the medicine that kept him alive, so as not to offend the sensibilities of tourists drinking piña coladas." He paused, and in the silence, Maya could hear the echo of a 14-year-old's rattling cough. A week later, he contracted a fungal infection. Aspergillus. It thrives in damp, poorly ventilated spaces. Like a service corridor. His lungs, already so weak, stood no chance. We lost him. Alistair's voice was hoarse, stripped of all its power, leaving only the raw agony of a grandfather. I owned the hotel. I owned the ground it stood on. I could have ended that manager's career with a single word. But I was miles away, and I had taught my daughter not to make a scene. My politeness, my privilege, my desire for quiet elegance. It created a world where a man felt empowered to send a sick child into a hallway to die. When I saw that woman, when I saw her hand on your brother's lifeline, I wasn't seeing Eleanor Vance. I was seeing a ghost. I was seeing the bill for my own silence come due at last. The confession hung in the air, a story of such profound, quiet failure that it dwarfed the loud, public violence of Eleanor's act. He wasn't a hero. He was a man desperately trying to rewrite the ending to a story that had already been written in stone. The days that followed were a blur of legal jargon and public spectacle. The world seized upon their story, turning Leo into a symbol and Maya into a reluctant icon. The video played on a ceaseless loop, a digital ghost haunting every screen. Justice for Leo was not just a hashtag, it was a global roar of outrage. Maya found herself the unwilling protagonist in a narrative she couldn't control. Pundits dissected her character, her brother's illness, Eleanor's motives. She was a hero. She was an opportunist. She was a testament to dignity. She was a pawn in a billionaire's game. The Finch Group's legal team, a phalanx of silent, impeccably dressed lawyers, insulated her from the worst of it. They filed the civil suit, prepared her for the criminal proceedings. They were kind, professional, but their presence was a constant reminder that her life was no longer her own. It was a case, a cause, a matter of damages and depositions. During one such deposition, in a sterile conference room with windows that overlooked a grey, indifferent city, she came face to face with Eleanor's defense attorney, a man with a practiced smile and eyes like a shark's. He questioned her about her training, her performance reviews, her relationship with Chef Antoine. The implication was clear. She was a disgruntled employee who had staged the incident, using her sick brother as a prop. "Ms. Washington," the lawyer purred, "would you say you had a contentious relationship with my client?" Maya looked at him, and for the first time, the sommelier within her, the woman who could detect the faintest note of cork taint in a world-class vintage, took over. She could taste the lie on his tongue, the false note of his feigned concern, the bitter, acidic undertones of his strategy. "Contentious implies a relationship between two parties of equal standing," Maya said, her voice quiet, but carrying the resonant clarity of a crystal glass. "I was her employee. She was my manager. What we had was a persistent, low-grade campaign of professional sabotage and thinly veiled contempt on her part, and a quiet, determined effort to do my job to the best of my ability on mine. It was not a relationship. It was a condition I endured." The lawyer's smile faltered. The Finch lawyer beside her made a small, approving note. In that moment, Maya realized that the skills she had cultivated in Aurelia's cellars, the precision, the memory, the ability to discern truth from artifice, were not useless. They were her weapons. The trial, 6 months later, was the culmination of it all. The courtroom was a theater, and Maya was its unwilling star. When she took the stand, she did not speak of anger or hatred. She spoke of the notes in wine. She described the faint, almost undetectable hum of Leo's machine, explaining how it was quieter than the clink of ice in a water glass, quieter than the murmur of a couple at the next table. She described the scent of ozone from the machine's filter, a smell that, to her, meant life, meant safety, meant her brother was breathing. and she described the change in the room's atmosphere when Eleanor arrived, the sudden drop in temperature, the sharp, metallic tang of pure malice. She made the jury see, smell, and feel the moment. But it was Eleanor's testimony that broke the case. Placed on the stand by her own defense, she was meant to be a portrait of a concerned, safety-conscious manager. But under the prosecutor's relentless, methodical questioning, her composure cracked. The video was played, and she was forced to watch herself commit the act, her face on the giant screen a mask of snarling rage. "So, Ms. Vance," the prosecutor asked, her voice deceptively gentle, "when you saw this ticking time bomb, this fire hazard, your first instinct was to yank it away from the child who needed it to breathe, and not, say, to call the fire department, or to calmly ask them to step outside." I was under pressure. I panicked," Eleanor stammered, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape that wasn't there. "You panicked?" the prosecutor pressed. "Or you were angry? Angry that a young black woman, one of your subordinates, had dared to defy you? Angry that this boy with his medical needs had intruded upon your perfect, pristine world? No, that's not. I am not a racist," Eleanor cried, the words echoing with the hollow ring of self-delusion. "I was protecting my restaurant." "Your restaurant?" The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "It wasn't your restaurant, was it, Ms. Vance? You were an employee, just like Maya Washington. You were just a manager. And on that day, you managed to do something quite remarkable. You managed to turn a 3 Michelin-star establishment into a crime scene. No further questions, Your Honor." Eleanor Vance seemed to shrink on the stand, the Armani suit that had once been her armor now hanging on her like a shroud. The woman who had built her identity on control, on standards, on the curation of a perfect, unblemished world, had been revealed as nothing more than a vessel of petty hatred. The jury's verdict, delivered in less than an hour, was a formality. The 7-year sentence was not a surprise. It was an inevitability. Victory did not feel like victory. It felt like exhaustion. The civil suit settled out of court for an amount that was staggering, a number with so many zeros it seemed abstract, unreal. The money arrived in a trust account, and its existence was a new kind of burden. It was the price of Leo's breath. It was the cost of his stolen future. For months, Maya and Leo drifted in the strange, untethered aftermath. They moved out of the 5th-floor walk-up into a spacious, accessible apartment overlooking the Hudson, a place chosen by Alistair. Nurses came and went. Tutors were hired for Leo, whose compromised lungs made returning to a traditional school impossible. The world was at their fingertips, but they felt trapped, encased in the amber of their own story. The breaking point came one rainy Tuesday. Maya was staring at a stack of mail, proposals from publishers who wanted her to write a memoir, requests from talk shows, and a letter from a woman in Ohio whose son, who used a ventilator, had been asked to leave a movie theater. The letter was handwritten, desperate, and heartbreaking. Leo wheeled himself into the room, his oxygen tubing trailing behind him. He looked at the pile of letters, at his sister's haunted face. "They're never going to see us, are they?" he said, his voice quiet. "They're just going to see the story. The boy in the restaurant. The sister who fought back. What are we supposed to do, Leo?" Maya asked, her voice cracking. "We have all this money, this attention, and I feel like we're drowning in it." "So we build a boat," Leo said simply. He picked up the letter from the woman in Ohio. "We start here. We use their money." He nodded toward the window in the general direction of Alistair's downtown office. "And her name." He spat the word, her, like a poison. to build something that they can't ignore, something that fights for this woman, for all the people they want to hide in the service corridors. And so, Leo's breath was born. Not in a boardroom, but in their living room, fueled by coffee and grief and a simmering, righteous fury. It was messy. It was painful. Their first project was helping the woman from Ohio sue the movie theater chain. They won. Their second was creating a national database, a Yelp for the disabled, where people could review and report businesses on their accessibility and compassion. The app, designed by Leo, who had thrown himself into coding with the same passion he'd once reserved for astrophysics, crashed on its first day from too much traffic. Alistair watched them, not as a benefactor, but as a student. He saw in their raw, unpolished activism a power his money could only amplify, not create. He funded them, he advised them, but he let them lead. He found, in the small victories of Leo's breath, a measure of the peace that had eluded him for a decade. He was a frequent guest in their apartment, no longer a billionaire, but simply Alistair, the old man who told bad jokes and would sit with Leo for hours, discussing the mysteries of the universe. He lived to see the Foundation become a national force, a name that made corporate boards tremble. He passed away in his sleep at 82, leaving a handwritten note on his bedside table. It read, "Thank you, Thomas. You can rest now." The bulk of his fortune went to the Foundation, ensuring its permanence, 7 years later. The air by the Hudson River was crisp with the promise of autumn. Maya, now 30, stood by the railing, watching the water churn. She had just won a landmark case before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, solidifying the rights of medically fragile children in public schools. She hadn't gone to law school. She had discovered she didn't need to. With the Foundation's resources, she hired the best lawyers. But she was the strategist, the soul of their litigation, the one with the unerring palate for injustice. A figure came to stand beside her. Leo. 24 years old, taller now, his face having lost its boyish roundness. He still used the oxygen, the cannula a familiar part of his features. But he walked without a cane, his steps measured but firm. He wasn't a coder anymore. He had found his voice in words, publishing a searing, brilliant collection of essays about living in a body that was a battlefield. It was nominated for a National Book Award. "Heard anything?" he asked. Maya nodded, not taking her eyes off the water. "She was released last week, Bedford Hills. A reporter called me this morning, asking for a comment, asking if I forgive her." Leo was silent for a long moment, the only sound the soft puff of his concentrator and the cry of a distant gull. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing yet," Maya said. She turned to look at her brother, at the man he had become, not in spite of, but because of the fire. Forgiveness feels like a destination, like a neat, tidy room you can walk into and close the door on the past. And I don't think that's what this is. What she did, it's not a memory. It's part of our cellular structure now. It's in the metal of your machine and the ink of the laws we've passed. She reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind his ear, an old, familiar gesture. I don't hate her. Hate is exhausting, and we have too much work to do. But I don't forgive her either. Forgiving her would mean saying that what she broke can be mended, that the pieces can be put back together. But they can't. We aren't the people we were before we met her. We're something else. Something stronger, maybe. But different. The scar is the point, Leo. It's the map of where we've been. Leo nodded, a slow understanding dawning in his eyes. He reached over and took his sister's hand, his fingers lacing through hers. She tried to create silence, he said softly. To erase us, to make the world quiet and clean, just for her. And instead, Maya finished, a small, sad, triumphant smile touching her lips. We learned how to make our very breath a symphony. They stood there for a long time, brother and sister, watching the sun dip below the New Jersey skyline, casting a golden path across the water. The air was cool on their faces, a shared gift. It was the end of a chapter, not the end of the story. The world was still full of Eleanors, of service corridors and dismissive glances. But now it was also full of the sound of Leo's breath, a quiet, persistent, and unrelenting roar.